Good morning and welcome WTCI members, board members, partners, and any new guests to WTCI's Global Business webinar series. WTCI launched this series back in April as a way to keep our network connected and to feature topics and speakers that are relevant to the local and international business community in the midst of the pandemic. Up to this point, we've covered topics including Maryland's path to recovery with Secretary Kelly Schultz of the Maryland Department of Commerce. With Bruce, we've covered the future of globalization, as well as global food security. As usual, today's webinar will begin with a 10 to 15 minute presentation from our speaker, followed immediately by a question and answer session and a brief closing statement. As a participant, you are able to submit questions throughout the course of the webinar using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom call screen. And we ask that you also include your company name with your question so that we can read that out loud as well. I'm happy to introduce today's speaker. Once again, we have Bruce McIndoe, President and Founder of WorldAware. WorldAware is an organization that provides intelligence to companies around the world to ensure that their operations and employees are safe and to eliminate any global business risks. I've personally known Bruce for about 6 years, which is the same amount of time that he's been on the board for WTCI. And prior to WorldAware, Bruce has worked for the CIA, NSA, the Department of Defense, and he has a bachelor's degree in physics and a master's in computer science from Johns Hopkins University. Bruce is also an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland Global Campus, and he's an expert leader in management, technology, and intelligence. Today's topic will be covering big changes driven by the pandemic, and we'll nicely wrap up Bruce's three-part series by covering some global trends and impacts such as global shock, climate change, technological disruption, as well as some reasons why we should hold out hope for the future. And with that said, Bruce, what can you tell us about some key global impacts that we can expect moving forward, especially now that we start to see a light at the end of the tunnel? And are there any disruptions that we can look forward to with a more positive outlook?
That's the goal in this session, to try to walk through a little bit about the future and see what's going to be largely impacted by the pandemic. We've been doing future forecasting for some time, and let's see if we can get this to move. There we go. So we've been doing future forecasting for about 15 years. We're on a model where we look at what the world will look like in 2050, so kind of a 30-year projection. And when we do future forecasting, we look at the interplay of these five, what we call mega threads. So globalization, which is what we started out the series on. Demographics, which has the largest impact on us, the planet, and our future. Of course, climate change, the environment we live in, technology that is a major disruptor in many dimensions, and then of course basic resources like water and food that are critical to our survival. And so as we look at the interplay of these five mega threads, we also have to be very mindful of what we call shock, or events that change the natural progression that we're seeing and create a disruption or discontinuity in our model. The shocks that we look at and have looked at since I've been in the business for 20, 30 years has been these three areas. Of course, nuclear war has been with us since the 50s and still looms large as an existential threat to a substantial number of people on the planet. We talk about biological shock, and we're living through that now, and that was always looking at something like a pandemic that would have global implication. Well, and obviously we're going to talk about that much more today. And then we talk about natural shocks. For example, an asteroid hitting the Earth, or a super volcano explosion that would, darken the Earth in darkness for years and years. But also things like coronal mass ejection from the sun that would put an EMP pulse and fry electronics and power systems and all those kinds of things. And interestingly enough, in July of 2012, we were 9 days away from a massive CME that would have been a shock. And of course, there's the other issues that are just things that evolve, and it's the proverbial frog in the pot as you turn the heat on. Is until it's too late, people don't always know that they're amidst really seismic or tectonic change to the planet, and that of course is climate change and what technology can do. And all of these do not respect national boundaries. These are global issues for global governance for all of humankind, and are very difficult, especially in the current environment, to deal with. So as we look at the biological shock that we're dealing with right now around the COVID-19 pandemic, this is a very telling statement by Angela Merkel, and so true, that this is the first kind of massive global disruptive event since World War II. And the massiveness of it is not in the quantity of people that are dying, it's the quantity of people and the economies that are impacted by this. For people that lived toward the end of World War I through the Spanish flu in 1918-19, onward to the World War II, we're talking about 150 million people that were killed. That was about 5% of the population at that time. And put this number in your head, 1.6 billion people on the planet during that time. And we're going to come back and talk about demographics in a minute. But it's this sudden shutdown of both supply and demand in the global economy that has been so disruptive to everyone's lives that are listening to this, on top of having to deal with a health infectious disease issue. So it is a massive problem, but it is multidimensional, not just health. So as we walk through very quickly, so hold your hats on, because we're going to talk about a lot of things that shape your future, our future, as I walk through these 5 megathreads. What I've tried to do is bold in red those things that we talk about, that the pandemic is either accelerating or decelerating. Most of them are acceleration. We were already dealing with an uncoupling process from China, meaning to reduce the amount of trade and economic interconnect between China and the United States. And that is driving what we call deglobalization. So really, since World War II, organizations and companies were interconnecting their supply chains and interconnecting commerce and culture and everything globally, where we became kind of one global people and one global market. That is now deglobalization is now accelerating, and the pandemic, which exposed so many vulnerabilities, like that we can't even produce, PPE and face masks for our hospitals, and that no antibiotics are manufactured in the United States at all. We are totally reliant on China, India, and a few other countries. So these vulnerabilities are going to drive very rapid decoupling in the years ahead. It's also going to bring and pull, because of that vulnerability for key kind of essential supply and manufacturing, you'll see things that'll be moving onshore, which means back to the US, or near shore for countries like Mexico, that's going to be a big winner out of this shifting of the supply chain, is going to happen. So So we're going to see this activity. We're obviously already seeing China being more and more aggressive on the global stage. They see this as a perfect opportunity for them to ascend into the dominant position as kind of the shining beacon of light globally, is how they would like to play it out. Luckily, there's many countries that are very leery of that. So I think for our perspective, it'll be a bipolar world for many years, if not decades ahead. So demographics, like I said, is the biggest challenge that we have in kind of what drives things to change, because ultimately we are the people that are being impacted. I think I mentioned back in World War I, II, we roughly had 1.62 billion people on the planet. We now today have about 7.6 billion people. That's up from about 1 billion people in the last 10 years, and looking to have 2.4 billion more people on the planet by 2050. So substantial growth. The reason I put this in red is because shock events like a pandemic or like the economic challenges we had in 2009, people, especially in developed countries, are not interested in having children when there's uncertainty. And the United States has already been in a 10-year slump as far as birth rate and population growth. We've actually had declining birth rates in the United States for the last 10 years. And so we're anticipating that that's going to continue because of this shock. So while the US will not see much population growth in the next probably 10 years again, we're still seeing high growth in other parts of the world. But what we do see with demographics is that these 2.4 billion people are largely, projected 80–90% to end up in cities. So seeing this kind of rapid kind of hyper urbanization and massive megacities. In China, they already have cities planned for 100 million people, not something like 10 or 12 million that it's in New York City. In the United States, we will see cities that will be probably in the 15 to 20 million people, except this whole change that we're seeing right now that's being accelerated on how we are dealing with this experience of being isolated in our homes and relying on technology to get food, to get supplies from Amazon and others, to work, to interact with our families via Zoom and tools like this, that this whole kind of aligning and changing an entire country's kind of focus on moving to this whole online experience is going to have pervasive changes that we're going to see in how people think about life, how work gets done, that companies are going to pull back from needing office space. We'll probably see 15–20% cut in companies' holdings of office space, and having more and more people work at home. And what we may see, and what we're expecting to see, is that once people feel that the living in a city and working and being close to your work is less needful, that the opportunity to have a family and move into a more rural or suburban, what we call far suburban experience, becomes more real, where literally people can live and work anywhere and still have a high quality of life, low cost of living, and a good work experience. So these are the kinds of things that we see happening in that dimension. In the climate change area, unfortunately, climate change is marching along as it was before. And I have here one thing in red, and that's because, yes, there's no question we are spewing out less greenhouse gas emission. We're burning less oil, less coal. less activity across the entire globe. So it is slowing the timeline, or I should say extending the timeline, slowing the amount of greenhouse gas and other climate change catalysts. But the reality is that what's happening in climate change is going to continue to march along until we make substantial changes in how we use fossil fuels primarily, and meeting that 7% target. We may see, depending on what happens in the remainder of the year, 3 to 4% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions against the 7% target. So it gives you some idea of what massive changes are needed to make a 7% number. We would have to basically do what we're doing for a couple more quarters to make that number. You can see that it's a very challenging goal to hit that 7% reduction. So resource scarcity is one that is challenging, especially in times like this, especially when you have manufacturing and food production and other things that are disrupted, especially on the supply side. We had that second session we just had last week on food security. And there's two things that are fundamentally important to us as humans. Number one is water. If we don't have water in basically 72 hours, we're dead. We're going to get dehydrated, become disoriented, and cease to exist. So that is an existential national security concern for any country, to have water for their citizens and people. Of course, right behind that is food. If we don't have food, then in time, and depending on different people, 30 days, 45 days that people can survive before they expire without food. But again, an existential threat if you do not have food. So any persons in any place, I don't care if it's the United States, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, if they don't have water, or if they do not have food, you will see increased unrest and political tension and potentially complete destruction of a nation state as they try to deal with this. It also forces migration because people are going to go try to find food. So resource scarcity from those perspectives are very important, but there's a lot of other resources such as energy and those kinds of things. So when you have a conflict, or whether you have a shock like a pandemic, it puts a lot of demand on concern around access to resources for both nations and individuals. So that's why this is all red. And we'll see more regulation, especially around critical items, like I mentioned, drugs and PPE and other key things that now the US, the government and others are going to be regulating about what can be produced where, because they want to ensure that we have our own internal supply. But I mentioned water, and this is one that's we've been working on and trying to support awareness around the global water crisis for many years, since 2005. And the other thing I wanted to point out here to this audience is that the United States, that you would think has so much, obviously, land mass and especially people on the East Coast, there's rivers and water and oceans and everything else. But the reality is, for a country, that we actually are at high water risk because of the amount of water that we withdraw from these aquifers and supplies. We're looking at a very major drought projection for the Southwest again this year, Cape Town and others as well. We didn't make the top 10 list, but it is still, water is still a major issue for the United States, and one that we are dealing with, and that's really the next thing. So So I've got kind of raced to this point to kind of give you a sense of all the things that are going on that impact our futures, many of which are accelerating because of this pandemic. Water and other things are incredibly important. And as Lydia pointed out, I'm now going to move to the reasons for hope. I'm going to start with resource scarcity. There's major technology that has been coming into the market, is approaching the market. All of this is going to be accelerating, especially as we look to bring more capability back to the United States, because if we can do things cheaper in the sense of technology, and if we can do things with robotics and other technology to reduce the human cost of producing something, we can actually be as competitive or more competitive with the globalization of companies doing manufacturing outside of the US, largely because of low labor costs. And so we're going to see huge investments in this kind of technology to bring this capability to the point where, for example, in an aeroponic farming, that's about 90% less than regular kind of traditional farming to produce the same amount of plant product. Farming, by the way, is the #1 consumer of water in the United States. About 60% of all water that we consume in the United States is for farming, livestock as well as agriculture. So if we can go into that agriculture component and reduce the water consumption by 90%, that's like solving the problem right out of the gate. Plus, these aeroponic farms require 1% of the land mass. So we can actually build these aeroponic systems near population centers and go from production to fork in a very short supply chain at low cost. So these are the kinds of things that are happening and that are being accelerated as we look to solve some of these problems. And I don't know if anyone was paying attention to Tesla and what they're doing, but a number of power storage technologies are coming into the market at cost levels now that rival or beat the cost of producing energy with fossil fuels. If this continues to accelerate, we may see in the next 2 to 3 years power storage and generation technology that will actually displace fossil fuel over the next couple of decades, which will be huge in solving the climate change challenges that we have. And I'll talk about 3D in a minute. So those are some of the things I'm hoping you get a feel for, that at the end of the day, while we have done a lot of damage to the environment and other things, that actually technology can be for good and evil, and in this case, tremendous technology that's coming online that's going to make huge changes to the planet and to our lives in a very good way. And so kind of continuing on this and finishing on the 5 threads, one of the other the 2 big ones that we're going to see here being accelerated and invested in because of the pandemic is this kind of what they call advanced materials or additive manufacturing technology, 3D printing, where you can actually produce a product right on site where it's needed. I mean, think about going into a hardware store and saying, I need XYZ, and the hardware store just prints it for you and hands it to you. Talk about shutting down supply chains and the need to transport things around the world. You can just deliver it right there on demand. So that kind of technology is rapidly advancing. And the other is robotics. You know, when we can replace a car factory in Mississippi with about 50 people and robots that was producing the same number of assembled vehicles that a 4,000 person plant in Ohio was doing, gives you some idea of the leverage of having robotics for doing repetitive kind of work. And so we're going to see companies as they're trying to bring manufacturing back into the US and closer, whether it's nearshoring or in the US, we're going to see tremendous investments in robotic technology to make that happen. And of course, the other piece of this is, well, we call it ubiquity, but this is where every person has access to high-speed communications, is very much on its way. And obviously, if we're going to have a more online experience as far as our lives and how we communicate, virtual reality, video activity like this, schools, access to schools for people that never had access to, quality education, will all be done through this communications capability. Again, has already been advanced in the investments that companies and providers have made to support what we're doing right now, but even more so in the next 5 to 10 years. So with that, I wanted to finish with a vision that we've had as we've looked at how the world will realign here as China, the rise of China, and ultimately India. We're talking about, over 1 billion people of each of those countries that are going to continue to grow and assert themselves. And we're going to see more kind of what we'll call vertical integration of kind of India, China, and Asia, and then the Europe and Africa. And then we talk about the Americas. And we see a future where as we bring this technology and manufacturing and activities back to our domain, and I'm calling the domain the entire Americas, that we have in our future the opportunity to have an amazing economic engine that benefits all. If you want to shut down immigration, create livelihood opportunity for everybody south of the United States, where they have an opportunity to live, to make a living, grow families, without having to migrate to the United States to provide economic support. And so when you look at all of the parameters, that's over 1 billion people too. So we would have 1 billion people to live and work together. We are tremendously more wealthy on a per capita basis than China is. So we have the wealth, we have the innovation. South of us, tremendous natural resources, obviously very short supply chains. We have the, climate is where, when we're productive in summer, the Southern Hemisphere, it's winter and vice versa. So we have continuous opportunity to produce food and other things that we need. So it's a great future and opportunity for us to invest here and integrate and create a situation where we have a well-integrated environment for all of us. So I'm going to leave with that, Lydia, and return back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. That was extremely interesting. As always, we wish we had a little bit more time, but
yeah, always.
We're going to take a few questions right now. So our first one is from Alexandra Hursky, and the question is, what responsibility does the U.S. government versus private industry hold in bringing back virtual manufacturing or vital manufacturing to the U.S., particularly in the pharmaceutical sector?
That the citizens of the United States are more aware, so they're going to demand it of our leadership and government, but it's companies and the incentives of those companies that will make it happen. So if it's regulation, they're going to have to do it. That's government. Or if it makes sense to do it from an incentive, financial incentive, then they're going to do it anyway. And so what they're going to try and balance both regulation and the economics to bring more of that critical manufacturing back to the United States, not only in health, but in other areas where we saw vulnerabilities in the pandemic that we're in the middle of.
Thank you. We have another one here from Anonymous. This is on robotics. So what happens to thousands of displaced employees and how do they get retrained?
So it's interesting. Two things there. One is there's no question robotics are going to displace tens of millions of people. But the reality is that it's going to create different dimensions and different opportunities, which is going to require training. And what we're going to see and already are seeing is we're going to see a tremendous growth in certification-based education, not a 4-year college degree. That's fine for doctors and researchers, but for the basic person that's out there trying to make a living, you're going to be able to go to an online course, get a certification in some particular area, and pivot to that job. And that's going to happen over and over again in your career as the entire economy and life morphs over the next 30 years.
Yeah, I feel like that's something we've already seen a little bit of even leading up to.
Oh, it's going to accelerate like crazy, trust me.
All right, we have a couple of more questions. We'll take some time. This one is from Douglas Lee from Invest Hong Kong. And the question is, how is this pandemic affecting rising nationalism and increasing income equality worldwide?
So 2 things. One is deglobalization by definition is nationalism. So it's obviously accelerating that because now people are saying, look, we need to be more independent. We need to be able to take care of our own people. So it's putting a lot of stress on globalization. So, and of course, depending on the leadership can take that tension and that concern and potentially use it to their own means. So that's one. As far as income inequality, that, globalization was a great boon to income inequality and in bringing economics around the globe to countries that had none. So we looking at income inequality taking a hit as people pull back and do that. But technology is going to be a leveler in time. And so that it's the same as when you go into African countries and their technology infrastructure is better than ours because they just bought it in the last 5 years. Our technology is 60 years old. And so in some cases, these other nations can leapfrog and create opportunity.
Awesome. We'll take this question last, but we're getting a lot of questions about this United Federation of the Americas, which I think everyone can agree sounds fantastic. And it's somewhere in between that nationalism and keeping a sense of globalization.
Sure.
It's difficult. The question is from an anonymous attendee, but they're saying it's difficult to see governments taking this approach similar to the EU. What kind of movements are going in that direction? And also what political hurdles do you see in getting something like the United Federation of the Americas?
So as we look at this, again, we're looking at a 30-year evolution. There's a lot of dimensions that are going to push and pull us to make it happen. We see it as an ultimate outcome. There's going to be a lot of fits and starts and those kinds of things. Does it actually have to be like an EU where there's some union or federation? No, it could be an economic cooperation group and be more loosely formed. But all the natural ingredients are there to ultimately be successful. Therefore, there's an incentive to make it happen ultimately.
Well, thank you, Bruce. If we haven't answered your question and you submitted one today, please feel free to follow up with us afterwards and we'll try and get those answered for you. Bruce, obviously it's been great. This is your 3rd week with us.
Yeah, sorry for my overrun, but it's a lot to cut.
I think it's a great tell for how great of a presentation you give, but even through this difficult time, you've definitely provided us with some clarity, and we love hearing some reasons to hold out hope as well. We hope that everyone who joined us today can also join us next week. We'll be chatting with Ryan Polikoff, who's the VP of Nexteris, on how to protect your supply chain during COVID-19. And we also hope that everyone will choose to stay connected with WTCI on social media. Our platforms will be listed on the slide, the next slide. But if you're also interested in getting more involved with the World Trade Center organization, you can contact me directly at lydia@wtci.org. My information's on the bottom right there. And Bruce, thank you once again for being such an amazing
pleasure
and host. We always enjoy having you. And we hope to see everyone here again next Wednesday.